Hello, and welcome to another exciting lesson. Last time we did a scenario in a daytime scenario using Corona sun and sky. If you haven't seen it, be sure to check it out. We went through the most crucial settings of Corona sun and sky and introduced a new way of thinking about visualization. So definitely look that up. Today we'll do something different. We'll have our first color practice and start to train our eyes. That's right. We want to know when the colors look natural or not, and we want to have full control over colors. It's such an important field, especially if you're just starting your career. We should stop trusting ourselves too much and finally get some tools so that working with color is not a matter of taste anymore. And don't worry, we will start slowly. We'll divide the color analysis into smaller chunks. More lessons like this are coming up, so you shouldn't feel overwhelmed with the number of decisions you can make. Today we are starting with something simple. We will analyze our images in black and white. So without further ado, let's remove the color from our images and see what kind of wisdom it speaks to us. Now, it may seem obvious, but a black and white image can tell us pretty much everything about the image. We are able to understand exactly what we are looking at, right? We know where the architecture is, where the sky is, where the vegetation is. We can distinguish that's a day scenario and the other one is the nighttime scenario. We don't need a color for that. If we bring the saturation back to 100%, it's not like we'll be so blown away that there's a grass here and oh my god, it's green. Mind blown. No, we already know that from a black and white image. And this may seem a little trivial at first, but values are quite a complex concept. We will break it down into smaller pieces. Over the course of the training, you'll learn how to adjust the contrast just by looking at a black and white image. But that's coming up a little bit later. Today, we will focus on a simpler analysis. We'll look closer to specific areas of your images. We will investigate the darkest and the brightest parts, the deepest blacks and the brightest whites, and figure out what should or shouldn't happen there. We will point out a few mistakes you should try to avoid there. We'll show you how to control those areas and think about them in 3ds Max and Photoshop, just to train your eye and start making informed decisions about them. Pretty interesting stuff if you ask me. So we hope you get inspired and look at color differently. So let's get at it. Jump to Photoshop and delve a little deeper into the subject. Okay, we have a beautiful image from our colleagues from Block Studio. We can appreciate the colors for a brief moment, but as I said, it's better to get used to the black and white renders. We're going to use them a lot, as well as the histogram. If it doesn't show up, you can go to the window, histogram, and it should pop. I have mine docked here, so all good. Be sure to switch the channel to luminosity, so there's no color information here. And you know, some people love using histogram, and some of them don't see any point in using it at all. But objectively speaking, histogram is very, very useful. We'll show you why in just a moment. By the way, we'll use it both in Photoshop and 3ds Max, so no worries. We'll get to it in just a moment. First of all, what is the histogram? And in short, a histogram is just a graph that shows us the distribution of pixels. In our case, it shows how many dark and bright pixels are there, since the image is in black and white, from 0 all the way up to the brightest pixels, which are 100% bright. If you open a nighttime scenario, you'll see more of these black pixels here. So what do we have here in our image? Statistically, there are a lot of bright pixels. They're almost stuck to the right edge of the histogram, although there's a small drop over here. And this is exactly what we should expect from this image. We have white clouds, white facade, and a fairly bright pavement. Apart from the super bright ones, we have the rest of the pixels kind of distributed evenly throughout the image. Side note, there's a cool trick here as well. If you select a part of the image, the histogram will update itself. It will show the values just for the selected part. So if we want to see what luminosity level should be the sky, clouds, pavement, or whatever, we can do it very, very easily. So let's get back to the topic here. We were supposed to talk about the darkest and brightest parts of the image. We will call those parts blacks and whites. Blacks will be the darkest areas of an image, which begin at the peak of black values. They will start at the left side of our histogram, and you can eyeball them looking at the image, a rough estimation for now. And we will call the other area as whites, basically the brightest parts of the image which end on the peak of white. It would be somewhere around here. And let's stop for a moment. Where do you think black and white levels supposed to start from and end with? Should the deepest blacks always start with 0% luminosity? Do whites, those, super white, always have to aim for 100%? Or maybe it's better if they go down to 90, 80, or even lower percent brightness. As it turns out, each picture will have those points in totally different areas. Let's take a look at another example from northern space, guys. Let's slap the black and white adjustment layer and check our histogram. The black peak in this picture starts about 17% luminosity and ends somewhere here, even though it is an overcast scenario. The black and white points are definitely narrower than in the previous example. They're clearly different. We might be tempted to take them down a notch, but we shouldn't. This picture looks natural as it is, and we only know this because we analyze the points of black and white. Let's check another example. As you can imagine, night and day will also follow separate rules. We'll see black at different points and white at different points as well. Let's look over here. Blacks seem to go almost to the zero, but the brightest part of the image, the sky, isn't that high at all. In the previous image, the sky was usually somewhere around here, and now it's a little lower. Alright, each image will have different black and white points. Every image begins and ends at a certain level, and now it's time to introduce a new concept. We will refer to the area from the darkest to the brightest pixels as the tonal range. Tonal range. This is the first concept you should think of when assessing your work. Are the tonal ranges appropriate for my image? Aren't the whites too high for a night shot? Aren't the blacks too low for a day scenario? Even subtle shifts of white and black points can change the perception of an image drastically. Black and white points must be carefully considered, and you can have a tonal ranges at the back of your head at all times. You can start to create this mental map of tonal ranges in your head. Spoiler alert, we will use this mental benchmark to adjust contrast later on, but that's in future lessons. And you may ask if there's an ideal spot for blacks and whites. Could you say that whites should end at 80% and blacks should start from 5%? Could I make a list for day, night, overcast, and other scenarios with appropriate ranges? Perhaps yes, but that's not the point here. It's all about looking at the images in black and white and getting used to different tonal ranges. You should get familiar with them and investigate if you do not commit any big mistakes in blacks and whites. If you're working on an image for a very long time, it's easy to get caught up and drive away from natural look. But if you set them right at the beginning, you can be more confident that you are on the right track. So, okay, let's start with a couple of words about tonal ranges themselves. We already showed you that they can be wide and pretty narrow. They can start from deep blacks at 5%, but they might even start at 15 or 20%, and it can still look natural. When you start analyzing those areas and tonal ranges, you'll spot some interesting things. For example, a super commercial day scenario often has a very wide tonal ranges, and those wide tonal ranges can potentially bring a lot of attention. Check those examples. The perception of contrast is pretty high, and we will talk about it in the next lesson of contrast. Pretty interesting stuff if you ask me, but let's not get too much ahead of us. On the other hand, you can have a pretty narrow tonal ranges, where white don't reach even 50 or 60% of the histogram. This kind of example you can come upon when watching movies, and there's a good reason for it. You watch movies during the dark, so that they don't need to grab attention in an instant. You're already watching the movie, so you can just as well enjoy it, and the brightness doesn't need to compete with the dark surroundings of the cinema. One of the biggest factors that make cinematic grading look the way it is the tonal ranges that are pretty narrow, and it's pretty interesting. Marketing images will have broader tonal ranges than cinematic and artistic content, and that kind of makes sense. High tonal ranges are perfect for billboards to draw attention fast, but the same wide tonal ranges would hurt our eyes in a dark cinema. We want to keep an eye on those tonal ranges because you will spot the second bottom real fast. Being aware of this fact will help you figure out what makes a natural look, and when you go more cinematic, you'll be able to use this fact to make your personal style, but that creative freedom comes over time. Anyway, let's dive even deeper into the black and white areas themselves. We can find many potential problems in those areas, so let's look closer at them now. If we don't know how to work with color, if we are not sensitive to it, we can easily fall into a trap. So let's look at some renders and analyze these areas one by one. Let's turn on the black and white adjusting layer and focus on the brightest parts of the image first. In this example, clouds are the brightest part of the image, and they look okay as they are. Everything looks okay for now. But they can easily go south. They can easily become too bright, and the histogram will tell us that right away. Everything is pushed to the right side if you look at the histogram, and that's a serious red flag. We're losing details. You can almost hear the histogram screaming, "Give me some space, I need some breathing space." Yeah, this is way too bright. Should this cloud be 100% bright? Well, it's rather unusual, but it happens quite often. You can see far too high whites in the works of far too many artists. It's a common mistake, and you can easily snipe it if you just look at the histogram. Okay, let's move on. And don't forget to apply the black and white filter on. Another problem we encounter with whites is when they are too low. They are flattened and pushed down. That's a typical behavior when you apply LUTs. It can mess with your tonal ranges in both blacks and whites. It drives us away from the natural colors and flattens the image. We lose details again, but in a different way than before. And by the way, images are all about the details, so it's such a shame you lose them unnecessarily. We need more space for these colors to really work. We can't crush and compress them too much, and the histogram will let us know right away. You should be sensitive to where those white areas land and if they are not flattened somehow. Let's do the same thing with blacks, the darkest areas. And a common mistake with blacks is raising them too high. For example, look at this picture. Now it looks natural. Looks okay when you look at it with all the colors, but let's not water down our decision-making process. Let's put the black and white adjustment layer again and analyze our tonal ranges. But as soon as we add a curve adjustment and raise the blacks up, we immediately see that it looks more stylized and less natural. This happens a lot, and many artists fell into this trap, especially when you use LUTs again. The outcome is gray spots and a muddy image. We lack the right ranges for this image to look the way it should, and it's only because the black points are too high. We should be aware of it. Otherwise, we will get a washed up image that looks unattractive. and certainly unnatural. And as you can probably guess, the last aspect we can investigate in blacks is another loss of detail. Of course, we view it all in black and white. By the way, there's an interesting tonal ranges in this example, definitely smaller than the previous one, but when it comes to the black themselves, we need to be careful how they turn out. We don't want to lose any detail here. If we go down with blacks, especially in night shots, we'll easily end up with black spots instead of colors. Histogram will tell us right away. Black peak is pressed down all the way down to 0. This is another red flag. First of all, 0% blacks are so unpleasant, but more so, they shouldn't appear that much in our images. 0% luminosity means there's no light coming to that area, but still, even in a daytime scenarios, you can find many areas of an absolute 0% luminosity. We need to be careful about pushing them down too much and losing details. It can make your image look dirty and fake very quickly. Now, the trick is to just be mindful of those areas, not to overdo it one way or another. And don't get me wrong here, I'm also guilty of making many errors in those areas. I see it all the time when I look at my old renderings. Gigantic spots of 0% luminosity, which felt nice and punchy at the time, areas with blown up cloud and so on. And if someone would just tell me, man, just give this color some breath, show some detail, don't make this color so washed out. Simple as that. We have to be careful with those areas if we want to have this natural and pleasant colors. They are super important. And yeah, sometimes you can break these rules and go for a bit more stylized effect. But before we start experimenting with it, we should have this mental benchmark of tonal ranges to not commit any mistakes in those black and white areas. That's a great way to break down an image and objectively decide if something is right or wrong. We'll show you how to use references for that purpose very soon, but yeah, whites, blacks, and tonal ranges. We are careful within those areas and we try not to commit any mistakes that drives us away from the natural look. We need to be careful within those areas and reprogram our eyes to see mistakes. And just circling back to the tonal ranges, you won't have a list of perfect ranges for any given situation, but there's a clever way to approach it. You'll see how to adjust it in just a moment, and you won't have to guess it ever again. Let's go back to the scene we have rendered in the previous lesson and use all of this new knowledge now. We have the image that we rendered in the previous lesson. To view it in black and white, we have to do a little trick. It's not enough to desaturate an image, tempting as it may seem. We might think that changing saturation to -1 will do the job, but we won't get the same results as with black and white operation in Photoshop. This is a slightly different operation, so we'll return to 0. And in order to properly view this image in black and white, we need to use the black and white LUT, which is included with this training. To use LUT, click the plus sign, choose a LUT, turn it on, and it will automatically turn on Corona LUT. Click on these 3 dots, choose black and white LUT, and now we have an image in black and white displayed correctly. We can compare them and see that there are some differences. We can see how the sky looks like here. We see a gradient from dark to light. However, when the saturation goes down to -1, this gradient basically disappears. So there are some differences, but we won't get into that now. In any case, to see the image correctly in black and white, we need to use black and white LUT, and we'll use this trick in this training time and again. Okay, now back to our discussion of tonal ranges. By the way, everything in this image is fine, since we have set it up correctly last time. We have set the depth, we have high contrast in the foreground, and the further we go, the more these contrasts decrease, as the aerial perspective would suggest. And last time, we asked you to trust us with the Corona frame buffer settings. In this lesson, however, we'll try to set the exposure methodically, to start thinking about it consciously and to have it 100% under control. So let's create a curve operator, and when we click on the editor, we'll be able to see what the histogram looks like for this image. We'll have it on display at all times to kind of get used to look what's going on with our images. Okay, let's reset everything and do it from scratch. And by reset, I mean we also turn off ACES OT. And this way, we have a true tone mapping reset, real raw render. Currently, ACES OT is enabled in Corona by default. That's why when you click reset, it automatically turns on. So we are going to turn it off again to start absolutely from scratch. We apply black and white LUT, and then we create a curve and open the histogram window. Place it nice and tidy over here. We can clearly see that everything is too bright. The facade's too bright, it just looks bad. The facade is as bright as the sky, which is tragic, to be honest. Everything is washed out and lifted too much. Judging by the brightness alone, we can say that the blacks are too high. And by the way, there's something wrong here. Look at the histogram. There are no colors at all on the right side of the histogram. There should be a lot of white spikes here, right? What happened? Now, this may be a little bit tricky, but I'll do my best to explain what happened here. It's not super important, so don't worry about it either way. You can come back here anytime. So, what basically happens is, Corona works in a much wider range of colors than your monitor can display. If you click on the histogram window and scroll back, you'll see that there's a lot more information about colors. We haven't seen it all before, because these lines here on the right cut off what we see in the frame buffer on the monitor. Every color past that line was flattened out and displayed as white. It's just the way it works. All this is sort of displayed as the maximum available value, which is 100% white. Look at the stones, for example. This part that is lit is just a pure white without any detail. It doesn't mean that there are no details in the render, we just can't display it. So basically these bright colors are just far beyond our scale, and we have to do some operation to narrow it down, so that it all falls within the spectrum we are able to display. And this operation of narrowing down the tonal range is called tone mapping. This means we go down from a wider range to one we can work with. If we click ACES, for example, we notice that the colors and the histogram jump into the right range. They've been sort of mapped on this histogram, limited to the space that corresponds to the RGB space. It all went down. We don't have that over-exaggerated whiteness anymore. Some details appear on these stones. This information is now available to us. Currently, ACES is the default setting in Corona, but there are older ways to do this tone mapping as well. We used the first one in the previous lesson, and it's called filmic mapping. We can add it here. Above the LUT. Let's create these curves again. And now we can see that as we raise the highlight compression, this whole range starts to change. We see how the histogram changes. Suddenly, these whites begin to get into the range displayed in RGB. And generally the value of 1 is the maximum value, which maps this entire image. We can see that we have some space left from the right side to 100%, so everything fits right into this basic RGB range. Of course, we can see that this picture is a little different from the one ACES produced. There are some differences in blacks and whites areas, but we'll talk about that later in the training. We still have a third option though, the so-called Reinhardt highlight compression. Let's add it here as well and move it over the LUT. We can turn the filmic off. Now let's turn these curves on. And now increase the highlight compression. Maybe we'll do it in a little smaller increments. 1, 2, 3. And again, we see a similar operation. The whole ranges go down to this RGB space, and as we go around 10, we'll fit it all. Just like in the filmic, just like in ACES. Personally, we don't use Reinhardt highlight compression very often, but we know that there are fans of it out there, so we don't want to skip it. And again, there are differences between the three, but we will come back to this later in the training. For now, it's just important for you to know that the first step you usually need to do is to correctly map colors from a wider color space to a narrower one. And you have several options to choose from. Nevertheless, we will return to what we have used in the previous lesson, which is the filmic. Circling back, the first operation we do after resetting the tone mapping is narrowing down the ranges. We move from these very wide ranges that go beyond the display scale to the range we can work with. But the problem is that everything is still very bright. So now we can move on to setting black and white points. We can see a peak of black and a peak of white, and we want to dock them in the right places for the image. We don't want to guess it, and we don't want to completely trust our eyes. We don't want to be fully subjective. And for adjusting the tonal ranges, references will simply be the key. If we are working on a daytime shot, we are looking for a similar shot in daytime scenario. If we are doing a night shot, we are looking for a similar night shot. We try to choose something that looks as similar as possible and is attractive at the same time. Something that we would like to strive for. And here, we obviously recommend using the works of our invited star guests. It's really lots of well-executed commercial and artistic projects that have proper tonal ranges you can investigate. So, we choose a render or a photo, check where their tonal ranges land, and then try to apply that aspect to our work. It's really simple, and you'll see what's all about in just a second. In our case, it's a scene in the mountains with quite a lot of trees. And we found a similar photo that looks like this. We have some sort of darker tree in the foreground, background with lots of trees. The depth of this image is also large, judging on these mountains in the background. Blue sky as well. So it's close enough that we can work with it. And like we have said, for the moment, we'll simply work in black and white. So in order to display this image in black and white in Photoshop, we need to add a black and white adjustment layer. What we are going to do now is basically steal the tonal ranges of this image and transfer them to our image. We want to see where the whites lie and where the blacks lie. And for this purpose, of course, we use the histogram. We can just look at these levels and see that these blacks are somewhere between 19 and 60, and whites say between 174 and 94 RGB values, of course. These are very specific ranges that we can simply transfer to our image. So we try to remember them. We go to the frame buffer, and we can see that in the context of the histogram and the image we just saw, both black and white are definitely elevated here in our render. We see that these blacks are washed out, whites are almost on the verge of the overexposure. And if both of these black and white points are up, then We just need to move them down at the same time, and the exposure will come to the rescue in a case like this. It's a simple global operation, shifting tonal range, and probably in any visualization with Corona Sun, you'll basically have to start with it. And as soon as we start to change the exposure, we see that we are shifting the tonal range all over. We see how the image changes, how the histogram changes. And at the moment, I'm just eyeballing what I think is the same as what we just saw in Photoshop. We can take a look at it. Obviously, it's not very accurate. We are still just trying to hit a similar ballpark with it. If we right-click in the frame buffer, we can see how specific pixels are shaped. For example, we see that the highest whites are around 235, and the lowest blacks around 13. The color of the facade looming somewhere around 20. We are able to read these values one way or another. But that's not important at the moment. The important thing is that we want to roughly adjust the tonal ranges. And now we can see what this operation looks like in color. So let's turn the LUT off, and bam! Suddenly everything looks much more natural. It looks good. And we are generally in a similar place when we finished the previous lesson. We set the exposure consciously, but in a very thoughtful, methodical way. We did these two operations, narrowing the range and reducing the exposure, so that the image lands in a place that's acceptable to us. It doesn't lose any detail and it isn't too bright. Of course, that doesn't mean this topic ends here. It's just that at this point, we land in a neutral point and we can do further operations, like set curves to adjust black and white, but we'll talk a lot about this in future lessons on contrast. For now, we do it at a very basic level. We are just placing a black and white points, which makes the exposure in the image correct. This operation is very important and puts the image on the right track. Often, the correct exposure will give us a very good tonal range, and we want to focus on that. We set the tonal ranges, matching them with another black and white image. And we can use one cool trick here, because jumping between Photoshop and 3ds Max to copy these ranges is a little bit inconvenient, to say the least. But there's a much better way. We can use an app called PureRef, and it's really great if you want to work with references and want to train your eye. And you do, right? So we encourage everyone to keep it in the tray at all time. This will really be something that will change how we work with color. The program is generally used to create boards with inspirations and references. You can arrange them in any way you want. Get inspired whenever there's an opportunity for it. You can go to PureRef's website, check out its features and tutorials. It literally takes like 30 minutes, short and sweet. Anyway, we'll do just one trick with it. It will serve one specific purpose. So let's open PureRef, and by default, PureRef will just be a gray canvas with no extra toolbars or anything like that. And it is a canvas we can put some images. We're gonna start with simply dragging the image we selected earlier from the folder, but you can drag any image directly from the browser without saving it to your disk. And this way, we can easily build our references database. Now, we want to display it in black and white, so that we can compare it to what we have in the viewport, in the frame buffer. So we can click here, Canvas, and Grayscale. As we can see, it's the same thing we have in Photoshop. The image is in grayscale. If we click back on the Max window, this will disappear. Well, it just behaves as a typical Windows dialog window. But we're going to use one great feature which is a game changer when working with references. We'll choose two settings here. The first one is always on top mode, and the second is overlay selection. This will allow us to reduce the window and dock the picture here at all times. When we work in 3ds Max, it's always there. We can move it around, but if we go to Max window, it will be still above it all. And just like that, if we now go to grayscale, we are able to move these images one on top of each other and directly see one area next to the other. What's the relationship of these blacks? For example, are the blacks here in this picture lower? How does the sky in one picture relate to the other? How are the highlights? How the clouds relate to facade? We can have both close together and compare them. We have full control over it while working on the image. And with these areas side by side, applying tonal ranges is definitely much simpler. So we can try to set these brightness levels once again. No Photoshop this time. So you can reset this exposure and simply place this image somewhere to compare them edge to edge. We can slide down the exposure until we feel that these colors are the same. It's important to catch a fairly similar point, and it already fits better. As you can see, these levels here are different. These shadows here are lower than in this picture. But we also have to remember that not everything always has to be the same. If we land too low with these shadows, then the whole image will just be too dark. We could also use the Rich Shadows option and push the shadows down. As we can see now, it's closer to what it used to be. But we won't do that for now. For the time being, just focus on comparing these pictures to each other and make grounded decisions based on that. It will also be the basis for many decisions that we'll learn about in the next lessons using more advanced tools. We don't want to complicate it too much for now. Overall, it's a very good habit, a great eye exercise. You need to see if you have a good tonal ranges and build a mental map of what anything should look like. But just to be sure we have exhausted the topic, let's talk a bit more about the frame buffer, about those other options that we have pushed aside so far. We didn't discuss all of them, and maybe this part will be a bit more intermediate, but even if you have never consciously analyzed color, you can just soak it in and incubate yourself with more knowledge, so that you can kind of digest it subconsciously and come back here whenever you want. Let's turn off the always on top option for now and go back to what we had basically at the very beginning. So we restart this option. This was our starting point. And a second ago, we've been using this exposure as a primary tool to move the entire histogram, the entire tonal range. But there are more settings in it. They allow us to have a little more control over tonal ranges of the image, especially in the lower and upper regions, the blacks and whites. And it may seem like there are a lot of options here, especially if we unfold the ones that are not displayed here yet. But in our workflow, we want to use all of them, just to keep things simple. We have our favorite options. There are some operations we like to use and some we almost never use. So once again, let's start from the very beginning and have a fresh look at it all. In general, these operations are grouped as basic, curve control, highlight control, and final look. We think this can be a little bit confusing, so don't get used to this grouping too much. Let's try to discuss them in a slightly different way. We hope it will shed some fresh light on it. We can remove it now, because it basically does nothing. Right now, we have just this lot that makes the image black and white, and the curves so we can look at the histogram. And we left the exposure at 0 for now. So as we can see, there's nothing else here. And just a few more words about the exposure. As a sort of reminder, it's a basic parameter which, as the name suggests, will increase or decrease the exposure. And it will help us to put the brightness of the image on the right track, where the blacks land and where the whites land. By changing the exposure, we change the image in a drastic way, and we have to be careful not to create patches of completely black or white color, as was the case when we discussed potential mistakes. That's very important. And now, moving on, let's go back to our starting point here. Another setting related to exposure is contrast. And the contrast generally extends the ranges in both directions. If we increase the contrast, the blacks go to the left and whites go to the right and gets stretched. We have distinct histogram cones that appear exactly on two sides from the center, which can be quite troublesome. We are forced to use the middle of the range as our reference point. And it kind of gives us less control, has a little less sense. And this contrast causes a lot of these ranges to stretch and we start to lose a lot of detail. This correction is often very aggressive and we rarely use it precisely because we have little control over it. So we want to use contrast, but we're gonna use the curves. And we will use the curves quite extensively. We used them to display the histogram so far, so I would have to add one more curves, one as histogram preview and one as actual operations. Okay, curves allows us to have extra control over the image's contrast, and we'll talk about them a lot in the 10th lesson on contrast. It's basically a very powerful, very versatile tool that can even be intimidating to some extent. You can work on the brightness curve only, and you can work on separate channels, which we will also discuss in the last color analysis in this training. Basically, any operation on the brightness of an image can be reduced to a transformations on a curve. Exposure, contrast, as well as more complicated operations like ACEs, Reinhardt or filmic. These operations are all certain operations on curves. If you really wanted, you could even not use those other operations like exposure, contrast, etc. at all. Do everything, literally everything, just with the curves. Just look at this. We're not setting any exposure. We have this curve somewhere out of the range, and we can just grab the points of the curve here at this 1, point and move it down. So that this intersection here is at the end of this range. And just like that, this curve allows us to narrow down the range. So everything that's under this curve, which is practically all the things to the end, is mapped to the image. Now we can close this curve and open another one to make it easier to work on it. And we may indeed have missed a few percent here, but basically we have got everything moved to this range. It's a little too dark, but we could grab these curves, push them a little bit, and we see that we raise this level of brightness. This way, we adjust the exposure, and we generally did what the filmic did. Maybe not literally, it's not perfectly the same transformation, but the effect is similar to using these two curves. We basically brought the image to the right range and set the exposure, more or less. We do not see any unbearable mistakes here. This is relatively similar to what we had before. So, as we can see, the right operations on the curve will lead us to the same results that other operations would lead us to. Obviously, we don't do it and don't recommend it. Just to let you know that we are dealing with operations on tonal ranges here, nothing more. Nevertheless, curves are by far the most universal and powerful option, and this feature can also be its biggest disadvantage, because the freedom of choice often means that you don't really know where to start. Using curves becomes natural over time, and we'll tell everything about them later in the lessons on contrast. Still, if you're not comfortable with curves, you can use the tone curve. So let's turn those curves on. I will remove it. In the tone curve, we generally have numerical values for highlights, darks, and shadows. We can enter values from 0 to 1 and to -1. By influencing these ranges, we have set highlights to -1, and the curve has changed. We can set the lights to -1. We see that again, the curve's changing. And the way I manipulate the curve may seem a little counterintuitive, and I think it's worth checking how exactly this option works in Lightroom or the camera raw in Photoshop. And I think it will be easier to understand what's going on here. We have the same image open in Photoshop, and we have a camera raw filter that will open in a separate window. We'll switch to the black and white option so that it's identical to what we have in the frame buffer. And here we have the curve variant, which is exactly the same thing as tone curve in 3ds Max. But at the same time, if we move the cursor over the curve, we have some highlighted highlights, darks and shadows ranges. And this transparent area shows the extreme limits you can modify this curve. For example, we can see how this operation affects the curve if we change highlights. In general, we could manually do it with curves, putting a few points here and there. But tone curves gives us numerical values, so we can have more of an influence on it. It's kind of a pity there's no curve visualization in 3ds Max, but in general it works the same. In Corona, we can simply operate on ranges like these. And at this point, we get exactly the same result as in 3ds Max. We see that we are modifying this curve. We can see how this histogram changes. So if you want to get to know the tone curve better, I recommend either Lightroom or Camera Raw. We see the feedback on how the curve reacts, how the histogram reacts. Once we learn it, we are able to enter these numerical values in the frame buffer with no problem. What's more, these are numerical values, so it's also easier to transfer these parameters from image to an image. I also wanted to say that in our training, we'll often use tone curve before ACES. ACES generally tends to darken the blacks in our scene a lot, and we'll use tone curve to bring those shadows up a bit. We'll use tone curve because it's a tool based on numerical values, and it's easy to enter them in each scene without having to modify curves each time. That's just to show you what we have in store for you. This goes without saying that both curves and tone curves affect blacks, white, and tonal ranges overall. Anytime you use them, be sensitive to your image in black and white, and try to avoid any mistakes we mentioned before. Okay, we have said the magic word ACES, so we can stop working with tone curves and go back to the 3 ways we apply tone mapping, namely ACES, Filmic, and Reinhardt. These are 3 operations that you'll generally encounter in most programs from Blender to Unreal. And if you get to know them once, you'll understand tone mapping anywhere. And as we said before, they allow us to map colors from a wide spectrum, from the so-called linear space to values from 0 to 255 RGB, and each of these three transformations does it in a slightly different way. There are some curve transformations behind all of these operators that have been designed to work fairly universally and improve the attractiveness of the image with a single click. In ACES, we get rid of these areas of white, setting blacks sometimes lower, sometimes a bit higher, but generally bringing us closer to natural look and tonal ranges. It often turns out that we don't need any other setting, no curves, tone curves, etc. And the whole scene looks correct with using ACES alone. Frankly speaking, same follows for Filmic and Reinhardt as well, but you need to be careful about their selection. You can expect different behavior in black and white, depending on which one you choose. So let's start with ACES. As we mentioned, ACES results in blacks quite low. We have seen them shift to the left across the whole range, and in some scenes this can be perfectly fine, but in others it can be a bit of a problem. Such a problem often appears in our scene as well, as you'll see in the next lessons, and you'll find out how we manage it, how we solved it. Still, you can expect attractive colors and contrast using ACES. Even just looking at this, even though we don't see any colors here, we can see that this image is quite juicy. The next setting here, as we remember, is filmic mapping. And the first thing that catches our eye is that we generally affect only the top half of this chart, and maybe even more. The whites certainly change the most, while blacks do not change almost at all. However, we have the second option here, which allows us to affect blacks and only blacks. So, breaking it down into these two settings definitely make the filmic a bit more customizable. Finally, we have the Reinhardt highlight compression. And as the name suggests, highlight compression basically affects highlights only. The shadows remain unchanged. We can increase this value basically however we want, but it no longer affects this image. We have a real influence on what happens when this curve up to somewhere around 10, and above that, it will have no effect. And Reinhardt is a transformation that compresses highlights, and we don't use it very often. But we know people who like to use it as a starting point for further operations on curves. Okay, so we have briefly covered the tone mapping operators, and again, they have tremendous influence on blacks and whites. But same as before, investigate what happens with those areas and don't lose any detail, and just to keep things natural. Now, maybe I'll just throw the ACES in so the image looks a little bit more attractive. We can also turn the black and white LUT off so we can discuss LUTs as a whole. So I'm going to turn on a new LUT, and we have a good amount of LUTs available in Corona. However, we want to say it right away that we rarely use LUTs in a commercial work. LUTs can change tonal ranges in a very aggressive way. The same goes for the behavior in black and white. So let's just take a look now on how LUTs affect the blacks and whites in the image. I will scroll through different LUTs here, and we can see that they can change the picture in a radical way. Even if we disregard the color aspect and look at how LUT affect the tonal range, some LUTs can make very aggressive modifications. Sometimes they are attractive, sometimes less so. However, The clue of this is that LUTs do something unspecified and takes away our control over the color. There will be a lesson dedicated to LUTs at the very end of this training, and we will smash this topic there. You'll have to wait a little bit for that, but for now, just look at how our values change if we change LUTs. They affect our brightness levels very aggressively and makes color look weird. That's why, for the moment, we suggest avoid LUTs as a part of building tonal ranges. We are trying to gain 100% control over colors, so let's do everything as it should be. The only LUT we'll be using for now is black and white LUT, just to display the image in black and white. Okay, there's just a few operations left to talk about. In fact, from the ones worth discussing, there's just the vignette. Everyone knows what a vignette does. It allows to darken the edges of the image to extreme values. In general, the vignette is a very useful tool when it comes to building a composition, because it makes everything less noticeable closer to its edge. It all becomes darker, disappears a bit. However, we can easily do it in post-production. We don't want to accidentally lose any details or make the blacks too low, so we want to exit the render stage feeling safe. That's why we usually introduce vignette in post-production, when everything else is adjusted as it should be. But if we want to skip Photoshop and take shortcuts, we can always add the vignette here. Okay, in addition, we also have bloom and glare here. Generally, it works around the brightest part of the image, blurs them, or creates flares. We have the option of creating a custom aperture where we influence what the blooms and glares are based on. There are quite a lot of options here, and we won't go through all of them now. The only thing we want to point out is that bloom can be a nice tool if we don't overdo it. It allows to soften the image, soften the edges between bright areas and dark areas, especially when we have a bright sky and a dark edge of the landscape that is directly in contact with it. If we are working on a sunset, the right selection of bloom allows us to break this CG look of the image and create something natural, something pleasing to the eye. Though, if bloom's too big, it makes us feel like we are playing Oblivion 20 years ago. If glare is too big, it doesn't look good either. Okay, the last parameter in the frame buffer that we'll discuss is sharpening and blur. A bit more of a fun fact though. Sharpening and blur can also affect black and whites in a way, especially if we have a lot of micro contrast. And sometimes I use this trick that I go above 1 with sharpness and set blur slightly below 1. It adds that little punch that can get the job done sometimes. We can see that this micro contrast goes up here. Nonetheless, this is just a detail that I mentioned as a fun fact. We'll also talk more about micro contrast later in the training. Okay, we've done it. We hope you have enjoyed this lesson, this color practice lesson. There are 4 more of them ahead of us across the whole training. Today we delve into the aspect of the black and white image and tonal ranges. It should always be a basis for any render we work on. We can look at the works of leading artists and steal the tonal ranges from them. This will help us stay on the right track. We don't have to trust our own eyes if we are just starting this journey with color. So analyze anything in black and white. Use pure ref all the time and get used to it. It will help you reprogram yourself, and you'll have the chance to perceive the color differently. We want to have this kind of mental benchmark and know by heart what a day, a night should look like. Also, We want to immediately notice any mistakes in black and white areas. Surprisingly enough, this will be the first and the most important step in the color process. So that's it. See you in the next lesson, where we put all of this into practice.